recording this session. So now let's begin. Thank you everyone for making the time today to join us for this anti-oppression training session. My name is Anika. I'm the Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist at the Ontario Council for International Cooperation. I'll chat a little bit more about my experience and the kind of social location or the perspectives I bring to this role, but I'm very excited to have so many of you sharing and holding this space today on such an important topic that we learn and continue to learn and always have more space to learn and grow with. So let's get started. Before we get down to the nitty gritty of the kind of skills and the overarching frameworks that we'll be using, I want to share a land acknowledgement. I want to specifically articulate that OCIC's office sits on the unceded territory of numerous Indigenous communities, specifically the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Along settler colonial lines, this is known as Toronto, but it's also referred to as Tiggeronto by some Indigenous communities. I also want to acknowledge that I myself am joining from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe on Two-Row Wampum Belt and Dish with One Spoon territory in St. Catharines, Niagara region, Ontario, as it's known along settler colonial lines. The reason that I do a land acknowledgement is not just to do the practice of saying the names of these Indigenous communities. Rather, for me, a land acknowledgement is a way for me at the beginning of a meeting, a session, a training to center myself and really reflect on why am I here? Why am I in this space? As someone who's been a social justice activist and advocate for many, many years and one who is still continuing to learn in this space, allowing myself this time and this opportunity to reflect really has me really bring myself to this headspace where I'm thinking through how am I taking what I am learning in this session, this meeting, this webinar, or the work that I'm doing here to be a better ally. I myself am not Indigenous, and so I can only ever operate from the perspective of being a settler, but also a settler who is a person of color and is impacted by many of the same systems, if not the exact same systems that affect Indigenous communities. So as I invite you all to reflect on not just where you're coming from, the physical land on which you're situated, I also invite you to reflect on how you're going to take, or you hope to take away, the learnings from today's session to stand in solidarity as a better ally to the Indigenous communities on whose land you live, work, and play on. Essentially, I hope that this workshop will be a way for all of us to move beyond words to actions. So I invite you all to maybe take a couple seconds. Please feel free to also drop in the chat where you're joining us from. I'm really, really glad and happy to see so many folks from across the country, and I really hope that this will be a productive session. So before we get down to the agenda and an introduction, I want to just make note of some housekeeping pieces. First of all, this meeting will be recorded. This will go up on our public YouTube page, and I hope will be a useful reference for you in the future, as well as other folks in the sector who and beyond who are not able to make it today. That being said, we will have breakout rooms towards the end of the session, and those will not be recorded. And I also invite you to feel free to keep your camera on or off, or speak when there's opportunities to share as you'd like. So I just want to make everyone aware that this meeting will be recorded, and that if you are having your camera on or your mic on, you are consenting to that being recorded. The second piece is that live transcription is available. So if you don't see it already, just click on the three dots on your Zoom window, and click on subtitle. It should say show subtitle, and then you should be able to see the live transcription pop up. The third piece is that you're welcome to engage in whatever way is meaningful to you. If that means sharing comments and thoughts in the chat, if that means taking notes, if that means having your camera on or having it off, I really want this space to be productive for all of you. The fourth piece is that if you're having any tech issues, we do have our OCIC tech support. We've got Kari on the call, so you will see her name as OCIC tech support. So if you have any tech issues, feel free to reach out at any point. And with that, I hope that this will be a space that can really cultivate your learning and your engagement in many ways. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Today's discussion will cover a bunch of topics. A lot of it will be foundational. We'll really set the context for, what is it that we're talking about and where are we going from here, and what kind of tools and skills can we employ in our own navigation of this anti-oppressive work. So our discussion will start off with, of course, the definition of what oppression is and what anti-oppression is, and we'll kind of look at the ways of how oppression manifests or how it develops or builds based on other instances of discrimination or negative experience. We'll then have a conversation about our own social location. All of us come to this space with very different perspectives and very different experiences, and that influences the way that we engage in this space. And then we'll have a quick conversation about operational frameworks. So what are the frameworks or the tools that we can use to analyze not just ourselves, but the wider sector, analyze our programs, analyze our systems, and how do we put this into practice? So we'll have a quick breakout session where all of you will have the opportunity to discuss with one another and hopefully make some new connections and really bring some food for thought right to the front of our conversation today. So just to begin very quickly, I want to introduce myself. My name is Anika Zoumi. I'm the Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist at the Ontario Council for International Cooperation. It's my honor to be able to hold many spaces just like this, and really bring to light a lot of the conversations that we're having today, similar to anti-oppression or along the lines of anti-oppression and anti-racism, but also to support our growing community of folks in the sector who are interested in these conversations and in this space. My particular passion is working on youth engagement and gender equality initiatives, and that's been kind of my bread and butter for many years. I also come to this role with a really long experience in anti-oppression and anti-racism work. I myself am a visible Muslim woman of color, and those are just the identities I do disclose. There are a few other identities that I choose to disclose in certain spaces or not, but at the end of the day, I live at multiple kind of intersections of identity. And in my past, I've done a lot of work around anti-oppression coaching, executive coaching on anti-oppression topics. And I've also done a lot of work in the youth advocacy space, advocating for young people who may not have their voices heard at international forums and conferences. And so I really come to this space with a lot of experience in this, but also this very core knowledge that I am growing and I will continue to grow. And so I'm very excited to hear from all of you. So before we get down to, of course, the tools that we can take away, I want to really hold space for us to acknowledge the history or the legacy that we're building on to even orient ourselves in this space. Why are we here? And it's interesting that we'll get down to kind of the news articles and things, but in terms of the policies that I orient myself around in the sector, and these are great resources that I will be sharing after this call, but OCIC has set a precedent 4 policies on these topics. And I highly advise you to take a look at these. These can be found on our About Us page. But we have 3 specific policies that I draw a lot of my direction on the programming side of things, or on the sector side of things, that I think set a good precedent for the conversation we'll be having today. So these 3 pieces are the anti-oppression policy, our monitoring framework, which builds on that policy and really looks at, okay, how do we measure and monitor the work that we do, and our women's rights and gender equality policy. And I'll share some brief excerpts. There's a lot of text, so I will warn you, and I won't read through the whole thing, but these are just kind of pieces that I bring and I draw from in my own work. And I also want to acknowledge this work continues to change and shape and grow depending on what's going on. So the anti-oppression policy is will continue to shift and adjust and adapt to our new context as we learn and grow. So OCIC's specific anti-oppression policy, and I've pulled this directly from the document, looks at the systemic and individual oppression as a result of power inequality. So really key terms that I want you to keep in mind. So systemic, oppression, inequality, and the ways that they're expressed through attitudes, beliefs, values, and actions. So for us, this anti-oppression policy allows us to reflect on how the work we do can or should eliminate all forms of inequality, exploitation, and discrimination, and how we can integrate equity, equality, and inclusiveness into the work that we do. Once again, I will share these with all of you following in a follow-up email after this workshop. But this is a really great resource if you are, for example, part of a small organization that doesn't yet have an anti-oppression policy. Feel free to draw on this. It's a really great resource. Our women's right and gender equality policy builds on the anti-oppression policy and specifically names the intersectionality that we need to approach, or the intersectional perspective we need to use and integrate in our work with gender diverse communities, and in terms of feminist analysis and feminist programming. Once again, a lot of great text, way too much to cover sufficiently in this workshop, but I really want to share with you kind of where I gain my direction in this specific sector for the work that we do. But while these policies and procedures are great and are really useful for those of us coming from the sector and looking to reshape our own organizations with the work that we do, why are we actually here? Why are we here in terms of what's going on in the world? And it's interesting that today is the 26th of May, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death, or his murder actually, at the hands of cops in the US. And I actually have a picture here that's from an amazing tribute that was done on Instagram to victims of police brutality, including George Floyd and Elijah McClain and Breonna Taylor, tons of young Black folk who have been killed. And so that's what this middle image is. The image on the left is one of 2 folks who are holding Bristol boards at an anti-police brutality protest. The one on the left has a Bristol board that says, "When you don't see color," and it has 18 gray boxes with the subtitles "Respected by Police" and "Murdered by Police." And the one on the right is holding a Bristol board that says "You can't see patterns," and it has the same 18 squares, but this time they have skin colors. And the ones with lighter skin colors are under the subtitle "Respected by Police," and the ones with darker skin colors are "Murdered by Police." And so it's just this a counter to the rhetoric of, well, I don't see color, so therefore I'm not racist, which actually invalidates the fact that by seeing color, you see the racist patterns that exist and that are kind of evident of the systems that we live in, and are products of the systems that we live in. And finally, the image on the right is that of an Indigenous woman at the Wet'suwet'en land protests right here in Canada, holding a sign that says, "I want my land back." And so why are we here? When we look at these picture is it's hard and it's difficult. And I do want to also invite you all to take the space that you need to and take the time that you need to really sit with this, because these are heavy topics, and it's not easy to really think about or sit with the discomfort of this. But we're here because the society that we live in, the patterns we're seeing, whether willingly or unwillingly, the patterns that we're seeing are showing to us that the systems that we live in are disproportionately affecting Black, Indigenous, and people of color, often are at the expense of their lives. And these folks, there is something that needs to be done in order to provide an equitable and equal opportunity to engage meaningfully in our society for all people, and not just those who are privileged, whether that's privileged racially, socially, in terms of wealth, in terms of sexuality. At the core, there is a system that we live in of inequalities, and we all have a responsibility here to work towards addressing that. But why are we here from the social engagement, from the international development, international cooperation perspective? And I have three photos here that I think are good kind of resources. The one on the left is from a really hilarious social media presence called Humanitarians of Tinder. And it basically shows or collates pictures of folks who, typically white folks, who uh, use folks from Black, Indigenous, people of color backgrounds, or essentially folks who are not white, as props in their photos on dating apps or on social media. And so you can see a picture of a man named Eduardo kind of pointing at the rings of a woman from Thailand, the ring she wears on her neck. It's a really interesting, it's of course meant to be a comedic Instagram or a comedic social media presence, but it's quite poignant to think about how many times when you see folks who have discovered themselves or been on international vacations, really centering themselves at in the pictures that they share back, holding a starving Black child, or pointing at different folks from different backgrounds as a way to use these individuals as props and not really recognize them as whole humans that have their own autonomy and their own history as well. The image in the middle is that of brothers Craig and Mark Kielberger, who founded Free the Children, then known as Me to We, then known as We. And many of us in the sector already know of the controversies that happened. And I invite you to do your own research, but this is another example of kind of the ways that the sector has a lot of work to do. And then the image on the right is a personal plug. This is a blog I wrote when I was stationed abroad in Jordan. I wrote a revised version of this for Future of Good. And it really, this is kind of a personal reflection from my end of what it's like being a development worker, a humanitarian development worker, who's also racialized, and really reflecting on the fact that a lot of the trainings in the program and even the sector itself was not built to help racialized folk navigate what it's like to be in a position of privilege and power, helping folks, when you can also see yourself reflected back in the faces of those people that you're helping or you're supporting or you're working with, and how the system or the sector itself was fundamentally built for white people supporting or serving others, and not for the uptick that we're seeing now of more racialized Black, Indigenous, people of color in this space. So why are we here in this sector? Because there's so much work that needs to be done in the international cooperation sector to really orient ourselves in terms of anti-racism, anti-oppression, to make sure that the colonial legacies that actually did predate or are evident within the kind of development sector or the humanitarian sector don't continue to roll over or continue to fester into our work. The last thing we want to do is reinforce neocolonial relationships. And I'm sure that's why all of you are here. So all of this to say that we can do better. We collectively, as individuals, as people, as the sector, can do better. But how do we do that? Before we can get down to how we do this, what the tools or the questions or the reflections we can make are, it's important for us to actually understand the language behind the work that we're doing. So I first want to invite us all to reflect on what oppression is. What is it? What does it actually mean beyond just maybe your own personal experience, but what does it mean on a systemic level? The definition that we see or that you might see is typically the use of power privilege by a socially, politically, economically, or culturally dominant group or groups to disempower, marginalize, silence, or otherwise subordinate another group or category. So these are actually definitions that I've drawn directly from our OCIC's anti-oppression policy that I think is pretty comprehensive. So it's essentially somebody using power or privilege to disenfranchise or disadvantage other folks who may not have access to that power privilege or may not have that power and privilege. This can manifest in terms of practices, policies, laws, or standards that once again disenfranchise or disadvantage a particular group of people or category of people. But the key to note here is that oppression highlights systems of power that reinforce injustice and prevent justice. This is not just individual action. Of course, an individual action can reinforce a system of power, but this is not one person was mean to me or one person neglected me. Rather, this is a person, if it is an individual action, it's a person acting in service of a larger system of power that reinforces injustice and prevents justice. And the reason, like I shared, the reason that we define these terms is because understanding the language and being able to explicitly point at an instant and talk through how it fits into a system of oppression allows us to be more effective at dismantling it. And on the other hand, what is anti-oppression? And I'm sure many of you have heard this rhetoric before, but anti-oppression is not just not being oppressive. It's active. It means you're actively working against a system of oppression. So you're actively challenging and removing oppression perpetuated by power inequality. So whether that's at the societal level, whether that's systemic oppression, or whether that's an individual action that is serving in that is acting in service of a larger system. So once again, this is not one person was mean to me. This is an individual is exhibiting an action or behavior and attitude that serves a larger system of oppression. So once again, this is not just not being oppressive, but this is actively oppressing the beliefs, actions, prejudices, and systems that lead to systemic injustice. I will share a quick content warning. For the next couple of slides, we'll be talking about sexual violence and white supremacy. So if you do need to step away, that's totally fine, and you can rejoin us in a couple of minutes. But I will be switching to the next slide now. So this is a really, really great resource. It's actually from the University of Calgary. This is from their student services resources and actually talks specifically about sexual violence. But I find this to be a super valuable kind of model as we talk through how oppression manifests and how it exhibits itself. This tool is called the violence pyramid, or the pyramid of violence, and shows how sexual violence is not just a result of, or doesn't just kind of manifest immediately at the physical expression level, but rather it builds upon previous levels of violence. So at the base of this pyramid, you've got your attitudes and beliefs. These attitudes, for example, racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, are essentially anything that someone believes deeply. Maybe they don't say it, maybe they don't act on it, but they believe deeply that positions one person or a group of people as superior to or positioned above another person or a group of people. So in terms of racism, maybe one racist or ethnic group is superior to the others. Homophobia, one sexual orientation or sexuality is better than or superior to another. Once again, these are attitudes and beliefs that someone doesn't necessarily have to articulate or say, but that they hold deeply in their hearts. If you are surrounded by a context, by a peer group, a family, or even a society that normalizes or reinforces these attitudes and beliefs, an individual might feel comfortable moving up the pyramid to verbal expression. So this is where, in terms of sexual violence, you can have them starting to make sexual jokes, sexually harassing people, bragging about sexual escapades, but you could also have this be making racist remarks, making homophobic jokes. So this is where people's attitudes and beliefs are starting to be verbalized. Once again, if you are surrounded by a peer group, classmates, society, family, maybe your education system that normalizes or validates this, people can feel comfortable moving up to physical expression. So this is where people start to actually physically express their attitudes and beliefs. So this could be hate crimes, lynching, police brutality, etc. And once again, if this is normalized, if this is encouraged, people can move up to homicide, suicide, or in the case of ethnic or racial tensions, genocide. So what's the point of using this violence pyramid tool? The point is to show that someone doesn't wake up one day and decide to commit sexual assault. Rather, it's an ongoing kind of buildup that depends on the lower levels of this pyramid to even exist. Without attitudes and beliefs that base themselves on superiority or inferiority, certain groups superior to others, without verbal expression being normalized or encouraged, no one's ever going to move up to physical expression. So therefore, it is just as important to intervene or dismantle systems at these bottom levels of the pyramid, just as much as it is to intervene when it moves into overt violence. The next model is another pyramid. This is specifically the pyramid of white supremacy that is from the Salisbury Institute and has been adapted by the Equality Institute. And this is really great graphic. But this is, once again, this is similar to that pyramid of violence that we just saw, but actually gives specific examples from the lens of deconstructing white supremacy. So here we have at the bottom, we have our attitudes and beliefs. We have, there's two sides to every story, politics don't affect me, not all white people. So these attitudes and beliefs that lead to the minimization or the invalidation of racism, of white supremacist systems, etc. If someone lives in a society or are surrounded by a peer group, a friend group, a family that normalizes or encourages this rhetoric, they can move up to that verbal expression. So you'll have victim blaming, racist jokes, you can have things like racial slurs, and when you think about it from a more systemic point of view, you can have anti-immigration policies, you can have Eurocentric curriculum. Once again, if this is normalized or encouraged, you can move up to the physical expression. So the KKK, neo-Nazis, burning crosses, lynching, hate crimes, police brutality. And these are physical expressions of white supremacy, of racism. Finally, if this is normalized or encouraged within a society, a peer group, a family, you can move all the way up to mass murder, genocide, suicide, homicide. Once again, all of this is to show that someone doesn't wake up one day and move straight to violence in a vacuum and commit a hate crime. Rather, this is normalized at lower levels of their experience, their lived experience, their social experience, and that you can't have someone exhibiting a hate crime who has never before made a racist joke, who has never before held apolitical beliefs, because all of the top, more violent, overt expressions of racism depend on the lower levels existing and being normalized and encouraged in order to exist. Once again, it is just as important to intervene when someone is having apolitical beliefs or someone is making racist jokes as it is to intervene when they are committing hate crimes. Because like a real pyramid, the top of this pyramid can't exist if the bricks at the bottom are slowly being taken out. So one final model that I like, and I'll go through this very quickly. This is actually modified or adapted from a medical journal that looks at empowerment of empowerment of patients in the healthcare system, which is really fascinating. But I found it to be a really great example or a model that I use in anti-oppression education. So at the bottom of the staircase, you have stereotypes. So these can be positive or negative, but essentially are beliefs that people hold about others that are typically founded in ignorance. So they're not legitimate beliefs. They're not, peer-reviewed or validated, but they're just beliefs that people hold about other individuals. If you live in a society that normalizes this, you can move up to prejudice. And prejudice is where these stereotypes or these beliefs start to manifest in a negative way. So you can have certain negative beliefs about a group of people without ever having interacted with those people, without ever having experienced that in a way that validates that belief. So once again, unfounded beliefs that are negative about a person. Once this is normalized, you can move up to discrimination. And this is where people are being treated differently because of their identity, whether it's disclosed or not disclosed. And this can be manifest in, the type of people you choose to be friends with the type of colleagues you work with the type of employees an organization starts to hire. So this is where things start to affect people and start to move beyond just the individual to individual interaction. This can move towards more so like hiring practices or larger spaces. And finally, when these beliefs, when this discrimination starts to become codified in our society, so whether through laws, policies, practices, that's when we move into oppression. This is where these negative stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination actually start to impact the way that we build our systems, the way that we interact, and the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis. So all of this is once again to show that this is not an immediate kind of escalation in a right to oppression. This is a progressive buildup over time and typically across generations that leads to overt oppression. So this is a lot of kind of conversation around oppression, but then what does privilege mean? What is privilege and its role in oppression? And it's important to make this distinction because a lot of people have this confusion around, well, I'm being treated differently. Is this oppression or is this discrimination? And once again, I want to highlight that understanding the language behind each of these situations allows us to be more effective in actually dismantling these systems. If we don't understand the difference, if we don't understand the language behind anti-oppressive education, we can't effectively dismantle it. We can't effectively work to be anti-oppressive. So I've got two different definitions here, one of discrimination, one of oppression. What's the difference between discrimination and oppression? Discrimination refers to the unfair treatment of someone based on their visible or disclosed identity. So it could be visible or invisible. This can manifest in words, attitudes, actions. Oppression is the systemic injustice based on someone's visible or disclosed identity. And so this can also manifest in words, actions, and attitudes, but it also manifests in systemic barriers. So while discrimination can exist or typically exists on the individual to individual level. So someone discriminates against you based on, I don't know, your height. They don't want to engage with you because, I don't know, you're too short, and I'm a short person, so I understand the struggles of that. But that is discrimination. But if it is a discrimination based on, or different treatment based on identities or your visible or disclosed kind of intersectional identities that fall within a larger system of oppression or system of injustice. So someone isn't hiring a person who with disabilities, or someone doesn't want to have dinner with a person who comes from a BIPOC background, because those are instances of discrimination or instances of injustice that fall within a larger system that disadvantages those groups. That is oppression. So oppression can manifest in individual one-to-one interactions, but only if that interaction or the justification for that interaction falls within a larger systemic injustice. So that's when we saw, for example, someone seeing I'll just hop on back here, someone being the victim of a racist joke, while, you know, person to person, you can make a joke at the expense of someone else. That doesn't necessarily fall into oppression. But when someone is the victim of a racist joke, because that falls within a larger oppressive system of racism, that is an instance of oppression. And once again, it's important to understand the differences between these two, because understanding them will allow us to counter many of the rhetorics that try to invalidate anti-oppressive work or invalidate anti-oppressive efforts. One such example is, well, I'm white, I'm oppressed because of all of this work that's happening. So if we're looking back at these definitions, and we're thinking about whiteness, and we're thinking about the way that whiteness manifests in our society today. Here in a Canadian context, whiteness is privileged, whether that means you are actually white genetically or you are white passing, you are privileged. We can even see this to somewhat of similar extent within the international development space, where many of the countries that are kind of recipients of humanitarian assistance or international development assistance, or even many of the countries where some of you may be working on your projects and experience or have experienced a colonial legacy. And so whiteness is still privileged in these countries where whiteness may not be the default or the assumed default or the historic default, like it's assumed to be here in Canada. So when we're looking back at that same definition or the distinction between oppression versus discrimination, white people can't be can't be negatively impacted within a system of whiteness that privileges them, that gives power, attributes power to whiteness. So they cannot be oppressed on the basis of their identity. They can, however, experience discrimination, because discrimination doesn't necessarily need to fall within a larger system of power. So this rhetoric of, well, now you're oppressing me, I as a white person am being oppressed, is completely incorrect. Because if you actually look at the definitions of discrimination versus oppression, white folks don't experience a systemic injustice by virtue of their race. But it is intentional that I use two images here, one of a white person who appears to be a woman and one of a white person who appears to be a man, because it's important to unpack this. So with both of these individuals can say, you know, I am experiencing oppression. In the case of the white male, who was privileged by both virtue of his race as well as virtue of his gender, this would not be true. This person cannot experience oppression in any case according to these specific markers. On the other hand, someone who is a white female, sorry, this should actually say man and woman, a white woman, someone who is a white woman cannot experience oppression by virtue of her race, but can experience oppression by virtue of her gender, especially in a patriarchal society. So it's important for us to recognize that an individual is more than just what they may appear to be. Rather, they have many different identities that each experience or may not experience oppression, or that each exist in kind of different levels or systems of justice or injustice. So even within whiteness, there are differences depending on your identity. So those white man cannot experience oppression regardless by virtue of his race or his gender. This white woman can experience oppression by virtue of her gender, but not of her race. And therefore, while she can understand what it is like to be oppressed, she can never speak to the oppression that someone who is not white will face. So a Black woman, or an Indigenous woman, or Indigenous man, or a man of color. So all of this is important to recognize that we are more than just what we appear to be. Folks may have, I mean, we could even say this man might have an invisible disability and therefore can experience oppression by virtue of his disability. This white woman might not have a disability, visible or invisible, therefore cannot ever speak to the experience of existing in an oppressive system by virtue of disability. So how does this equip us to reflect on our own location? So once again, like I said, this white woman can't speak to the experience of oppression, but can never speak to the experience of oppression by virtue of her race. So understanding where you sit in kind of relation to all of these types of privileges and the systems also allow us to understand where and when it is appropriate for us to speak to the issues. So I myself, as a Muslim woman of color, it is appropriate for me to speak to oppression by virtue of my religion. It is appropriate for me to speak to oppression by virtue of my race, but it is never appropriate for me to speak to oppression by virtue oppression of a Black person, because I'm not Black and I can never understand that. So in order to understand where it is appropriate for us to speak to these experiences, and of course, we're also where it's important for us to leverage our privilege to create space for more of these conversations, we have this resource called, or we have this concept called social location or positionality. So this refers to the position that an individual holds in society based on the systems of power and value that are reinforced by that society. So a really great resource, and I'll drop the link to this in the chat, and I invite you to spend the next couple of minutes to think through the intersecting identities you hold. So race, class, wealth, religion, et cetera, that influence the approach, the way that you approach the work that you do. And I'll share this. This is what I call, or not what I call, this is actually called the social identity wheel. And it really kind of delineates the different identities you can have: the ethnicity, race, socioeconomic class, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And I really invite you to spend the next couple of minutes independently thinking through, where you fall on each of these things, on each of these indicators, but also the identities you think about most often, and then the identities you think about least often. And there's a reason that I invite you to reflect on this. So to all of you in the audience, I appreciate you listening thus far, but let's take a couple of minutes just in silence to independently think through this and reflect on this. I'll invite us back in a couple of minutes. I just want to flag that you're not expected to share these, so feel free to do this kind of as an own independent reflective practice. But if you'd like, you're more than welcome to share some of your insights or thoughts in the chat. just another minute or so for everyone. Once again, I will share these resources after the workshop as well. So you will have more time afterwards to really sit with this and think through it more intentionally as well. Fantastic. Thank you everyone for holding that space. So like I said, I will share this resource with you afterwards so that you can continue to think through that, your own identity and your own social location. So I want us to really think through, what the point is of understanding all of this and understand these models and these terms and these definitions. And I want us to locate ourselves not as individuals, but as a sector. Where do we sit? And I say at OCIC here, but you can actually use this as a place mark for any of your organizations, or even use an individual, a professional, a professor, a practitioner in the international cooperation sector. We sit in the space of mitigating or perpetuating oppression, because understanding our privilege from an institutional standpoint is critical to ensuring that we don't perpetuate the oppression, because we have the power to change things. We have the power in this position of leadership to change the rhetoric or the context of the sector. So once again, revisiting the staircase of oppression, we are here not at the point where we're oppressing people, but we're at the point where we can address oppression. And that's an opportunity. So how do we do it? I mean, like I said, that's an opportunity because most folks only ever get to, in their individual lives, the point where they can address stereotypes in their family or their friend group, prejudice or discrimination. But within the sector, within your organizations, within your programming, you have the opportunity to really work from the top down, which is very unique, and not very many people have that opportunity in their lives. So how do we do this? What are the tools that we can equip ourselves with so that we can effectively take part in working towards anti-oppression in our own sectors, our own work, our own lives, whether that's as an academic, whether that's as a practitioner, whether that's as a specialist? So how do we do this? 3 operational frameworks that I will introduce you to today, just as a teaser into the larger kind of field of academic frameworks. These are the ones that I have worked most personally and professionally with, but there's tons of others. The ones I'll cover today are intersectionality, anti-racism, and anti-oppression. But I highly encourage you to take a look at tons of other resources, specifically, and I'll name specifically critical disability studies, which looks at things from an anti-ableist perspective as well. But just for the purposes of today, we'll look at these 3 as a way for us to equip ourselves with the skills to observe or to look at a framework and then pull out relevant questions to reflect on in our own practice. So the 3 frameworks here are intersectionality. So this is the framework that looks at the intersecting ways that identity privileges or disenfranchises individuals. So I shared with you earlier that the experiences of all white people is not the same, because the experience of a white man is different from the experience of a white woman, and the experience of a disabled white man is different from the experience of a disabled white woman, a able-bodied white woman. And that's very, very different than the experience of a disabled Black woman or a disabled Black non-binary person. So intersectionality looks at the ways that all of these identities intersect and kind of compound and interplay with one another. Anti-racism falls under the wider umbrella of anti-oppression, specifically looks at racial hierarchies. And then the anti-oppressive framework looks at the ways to mitigate and reduce the effects of systemic hierarchies. So whether that's a racial hierarchy, like a hierarchy based on sexual orientation, a hierarchy based on physical abilities, etc. So the first one, which is one of my favorite, is intersectionality. So this is coined by the Black feminist academic Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989 in one of my favorite journal articles to read. And she invites folks to reflect on the following questions as they work in whatever space it is. And she's specifically an academic, but this can be applied to any sector. And I'm sure some of you are already thinking through how this applies to your own work. So first of all, how do people experience the different facets of their identity? So how do different people experience, for example, being a woman? And then how does a Black woman experience being a woman versus a white woman? One example that I'll share, and I think intersectionality is reduced often to just this compounding. So someone is Black, so they experience racism, and someone's a woman, so they experience sexism, and therefore they experience both racism and sexism. But intersectionality prompts us to reflect more deeply. The way that a Black woman experiences racism and sexism is unique to the fact that she's Black. So think about white femininity versus Black femininity. A white woman in society can be celebrated as innocent, naive, pure, which is why you have so many historic and current kind of fear-mongering tactics that are based on we shouldn't let these people of color take advantage of our white woman. That is something that's heard often in anti-immigrant sentiment. Conversely, this narrative of the Black woman being loud and kind of difficult to tame, or you hear the racist stereotype of the angry Black woman. So a Black woman, unlike a white woman who is kind of celebrated for her naivety, her innocence, her purity, a Black woman is archetyped as loud or angry, or in some cases even violent. So the fact is that being Black in a woman and being white in a woman is not just as a Black woman, you experience both racism and sexism, and as a white woman, you just experience sexism. Rather, the way that a Black woman experiences sexism is unique to the fact that she's both Black and a woman. So that's that first question. How do people experience the different facets of their identity? Second question, how do social context and hierarchy, so whether these are formal or informal, influence our perceptions? So you can look to society, you can look to even your own, whether it's like a cultural group, or whether you have peers that are from, for example, like I know the 2S LGBTQ plus community tends to congregate. So are there hierarchies that are formal or informal that are manifesting there? And that might result in oppression. How do our own identities reinforce? Oh, and that's not to say that there always will be hierarchies reinforced within those smaller groups, but this is to drive home the point that these hierarchies can be both systemic, but also can exhibit themselves more informally, even in smaller groups that, for example, within a lot of South Asian, as a person who is South Asian, I can speak to this in a lot of South Asian communities, you can see hierarchies that are serving anti-Blackness rhetoric. So how do these social contexts and these hierarchies that are formal or informal influence our perceptions? Third question, how do our own identities reinforce these hierarchies? Are we continuing to take advantage of our power or our privilege in whatever way that might manifest to continue to systemically oppress people who are less privileged than us? Are we speaking over people who should be rightfully speaking because they have more of an understanding or are more appropriate to speak to that identity? So how are our own identities reinforcing these hierarchies? And I especially invite you, those of you in positions of leadership, to reflect on this. And what are we missing by only applying one critical lens? So only applying an anti-racist lens. What are we missing? Only applying an anti-ableist lens. What are we missing? Only applying an anti-sexist lens. What are we missing? And specifically in our context, so in the context of the sector, these 4 questions, and I'll give you folks some time to reflect on this together in groups, is how might our actions be reinforcing existing oppressive structures? Who is missing in the design and development of our policies and best practices? Do the interventions of our sector address the compounded effects of oppression, or does it only address one section? Does it only address an anti-racist approach? Does it only address an anti-sexist approach? Or does it actually address all of the compounded effects? And finally, whose perspectives are informing the sector's work? Is it just white folk? Is it just white women? Is it just people from wealth or class privilege? Or is it actually a wide, diverse variety of people who are operating from their lived experiences and aren't just visible diversity? The second framework is the anti-racist framework. And so, like I said, this is a subset of intersectionality and anti-oppression. This looks specifically at the ways that racial and ethnic hierarchies are replicated or reinforced. And you can extend this to anti-colonial frameworks as well. So the two questions it prompts us to reflect on are, how do current institutions and societal norms reinforce racial hierarchies? And what systemic mechanisms currently disenfranchise BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color? In our context, so in the sector, we can reflect on these four questions. So first of all, the same question, how might our actions be reinforcing these same existing oppressive structures? And whose perspectives are informing the sector's work? But also, what are the optics of Canadian and Ontario-based organizations working in the global South? And how are we working to correct those optics or those neo-colonial, potentially neo-colonial relationships? And finally, how might Canadian ideals or norms be imposed in target community? Can they be? Are they being imposed in those target communities? So really reflecting on those can be helpful. And our final framework is the anti-oppressive framework. So this is, once again, moving beyond just addressing discrimination to actually addressing the systems that lead to oppression and injustice. So this is a result of treating the illness and not just the system. So the two questions here are, how is power constructed and maintained in our current context, for whom and at whose expense? So who is benefiting from power and who is being disenfranchised by that power being exhibited? And what are the roots of oppression? So why do these beliefs, systems, or practices exist? And once again, for the sector, here are the four questions. So these first two similar questions: how might our actions be reinforcing existing oppressive structures, and whose perspectives are informing the sector's work? But also, are we only addressing the symptoms of the problems or the root cause? And do we practice practical diversity? So diversity that allows people to operate from lived experience and not just be representatively diverse. So we have, a Black person in the room. I always say a good analogy is if you have a board or an executive committee of all white men and you switch out one of them for a Black woman and the work gets done exactly the same, you're probably practicing just representative diversity. Diversity for the sake of saying we have diversity. But practical diversity means that those people's identities fundamentally shift the way the work is being done. So really reflecting on, do we practice practical diversity or just representative diversity? And so what I'd like to invite you all to do is actually, we'll have the opportunity now. Sorry, I'm having a couple tech difficulties. Great. So what I'll invite you folks to do now is really reflect. This has been a lot of information, but I think we have about 20 minutes now to really think through the work of the sector and how we can bring these thoughts back, how we can bring these reflections, these questions, these pieces back to the work that we do daily, or even the way that we approach, if you're a student or just an individual, the way that we approach our navigation in the sector. So we'll be moving into breakout sessions. And once we move into those breakout sessions, I invite you, based on your group, you'll see that you're in room 1, room 2, room 3, room 4. I invite you to hop on into this Google Jamboard that I'm going to drop the link to in the chat. Great. So you can see this Google Jamboard, and once you drop in, you'll probably hop into this from international to intersectional cooperation. And I see some of you folks joining already. And depending on which room you are, so if you're in room 1, you'll be assigned to the slide that says group 1. If you're in room 2, you'll be assigned to the slide that's group 2. And I invite you to kind of think through this big question. How do these frameworks apply to our sector or to our work? And you can take this from whether you're a program manager or an executive and reflect on that in your own space, or you can take this to mean, you as an individual. How can you individually bring these questions to your work? And just a reminder, if you click over into slide 3, you'll find the questions that we're really focusing on. And just a quick and easy usage of or kind of tutorial to how to use Google Jamboard. If you click right here into this board here and you click on sticky note, you can just type something into the sticky note, drop it in, drag it around. You can even change the colors. If you're feeling really fancy, you can spin it around, make it bigger, smaller. So I invite you and your groups. We'll be randomly assigning you folks to hop into your corresponding Google Jamboard link and have a quick conversation. Maybe you can all share where you're coming from, what perspective you're bringing, and how you're really being pushed to reflect on these questions. And I'll give you folks about 15 to 20 minutes before we come back and kind of wrap up and share any specific thoughts that you might want to share. So if there are no questions, we're good to open those rooms, those breakout rooms. So you can go ahead with that. Once again, a reminder that none of the breakout rooms will be recorded. So please feel free to engage as authentically as you feel comfortable. So just restarting the recording again, but I'd love to maybe take some time for each of you to share any thoughts that you might have had. I see lots of really great responses in the Jamboard, and I also invite you, like I said, I will share this Jamboard again afterwards, so please feel free to use this as a tool with your own organizations, your friends, your peers, if it's helpful. But maybe I'd like to invite each group to share maybe a minute of their thoughts or their reflections. So is there someone from group 1? I'm happy to put the Jamboard up on screen share, but I'm also happy just to hear from all of you. But is there anyone from group 1 who would like to share what you chatted about? That was the group working on this Jamboard. And feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat as well if you'd like.
I can speak for my group if they're comfortable doing that. So we kind of talked about some of the challenges that we face in really using some of these frameworks. Our day-to-day relationships with beneficiaries and our donors really do have these inherent power structures that sometimes we forget. And we really talked about how terminology is not universal. When you're talking to partners on the ground and you say, well, do you identify as Black? They might say, no, I identify as African. The way that we understand power relations with North to North terminology isn't universal. So it's important when we're talking to our donors, especially on a governmental level, to really challenge some of the things that they take for granted, some of the policies and procedures that we might want to implement or hold our partners accountable to that just aren't applicable. We talked about the importance of getting real data and understanding the power relations at play and taking an active role to really implement the things that we're learning more than just a conversation.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. That's fantastic. I'm really glad that you were able to, despite it being such a short breakout session, get into some of those real nitty-gritty questions and reflections. Is there anyone who would like to share from the second group? I don't see any notes in the Jamboard, but that's fine. I assume that that meant that there were lots of really deep conversations. And if there's no one who wants to share, that's also fine. Just pulling out or pulling up group 3. Is there anyone who'd like to share from group 3's working group? I see the note that all of these frameworks collectively rather than separately are integral in the foundation of our work, how we communicate, engage, and facilitate in our various roles. I love that. I assume that there was a diversity of folks involved there. Anyone who'd like to share? From the silence, I'm going to assume no. And then from group 4, I see a lot. So I'd love to hear from someone here on the questions and the thoughts that and reflections that you had here. Is there anyone from this group who would like to maybe share in about a minute what you talked about?
Sure, I'd be willing to share for our group.
Go for
So
it.
we had a wealth of conversation come up, but some of the core things that we talked about was kind of the historical context of our sector, so kind of rooted in a colonization and how that impacts a lot of the issues that we kind of see when trying to apply these frameworks. So a lot of our conversation talked about hurdles in getting access, so through donors, through like governments, and how there's kind of a fine line with some of our organizations, and how far can we talk about different issues, and what's the fine line between being too political and being kind of an advocate organization, and then working in nonprofit but relying on government funding. So there's kind of multiple things at play there, but we were kind of talking about how can we incorporate these frameworks when things might be a little bit more tricky and there's kind of political things to take into account. So we talked about that. And then we also had a couple questions pop up, like how do we build these frameworks to encompass anti-oppressive frameworks, anti-racism, and intersectionality kind of into one overarching framework, building that into organizational protocols. So yeah, we had a really dynamic conversation. So thank you to everyone who was in my group.
Thank you so much. Sounds like, once again, lots of really great, reflective, deep questions. I hope that, like I said, that this is not the start and end of these conversations, that there will still be pieces that you'll take back to your own work and your own daily reflections. And finally, once again, I don't see anything from Group 5's Jamboard, but is there anyone from Group 5 who might like to share their insights or thoughts?
So one thing that I discussed in my group was talking about how when it comes to school, a lot of times teachers and other people who work with youth don't really consider their intersectional identities and what goes into them being and behaving at school. For example, like I talked about how, like, you know how they have those like leadership camps. Oftentimes teachers will pick like the best overachieving kid in their class, but that's kind of unfair because there are a lot of other kids who would probably love the opportunity but don't because they're struggling in school, not because of like stuff they can control, maybe it's stuff going on at home, but teachers and other youth workers don't really consider that.
Thanks so much for sharing that, for sure. And I think that's a great example of how you can take this beyond the implications in in the sector or in your organizations, but even to your own interaction person to person. If you work with youth or you work with young people or individuals from some of these systemically marginalized communities, these are questions that you should be really thinking. If you're even walking down the street and you see kind of a family or you have a child and they have friends who are maybe going through different things, these will, I hope, also help prompt you to reflect on how these play into your own lives beyond the sector as well. So Just very quickly, this will bring us towards the end of our session here today. So the big question I want us to ask is, well, where do we go from here? What's next? And I just want all of you to really reflect on the fact that it's okay to sit with discomforts. These questions are difficult and they are hard. And a lot of times they can be really confusing and uncomfortable for us, especially when we're put in the position of facing our own privilege and facing our own potentially harmful behaviors or attitudes, intentionally or not. I hope that this session will be a starting point for all of you to continue to reflect and change and shape, because this is a journey. You're not going to one day wake up and be anti-oppressive completely and 100%, but every single day we can work together to step forward and move forward towards being more anti-oppressive and being more of an ally, or standing or acting in better solidarity with communities. So I just want to thank all of you for bringing your authentic selves to this space and really engaging in some of these conversations and these questions for reflection that are really vulnerable and uncomfortable sometimes. It's all part of the journey. So just a quick summary of what we've done today. We've had the chance to understand specifically the language of oppression and anti-oppression. We've recognized how it shows up in our lives through specific examples. We've understood our own social location, or we will continue to understand our own social location and why it matters. You've looked at a few operational frameworks, just a handful, but some pretty strong ones, and then really thought through how we can apply this to our work, and then started to put some of those pieces into practice. We've also created time and space for reflection. And I hope that this has been a really valuable experience for all of you. So some additional resources, I don't want you to feel like this is the only resource you have. Like I said, I will share the slides of the recording, as well as the 2 anti-oppression policy and the women's right and gender equality policy that we use at OCIC. And I invite all of you, if you don't have one already, to learn from and adapt and pull from as you create your own for your organizations. But some additional resources, social media. I love social media. I learned so much of my own anti-oppressive kind of strategies and lessons from different social media accounts. Some that I can recommend include Platform or Future Ancestors. These are their Instagram tags. Highly recommend it, but there's a ton more. So I invite you to also drop in the chat some of the recommendations you might have. For those of you that are not already part of the Gender Equality Hub, feel free to join. We have trainings just like this, so we'll have a couple more in the coming year. And then we also have Hub-only member roundtables where we get to learn from organizations in the sector and kind of share our own best practices. It's completely free to join, and we typically meet about once a month. So the expectations or the commitments are not too high. So if you're interested, feel free to email me at any time at anika@ocic.on.ca. And of course, follow us on social media. OCIC always shares opportunities and resources and organizations and events that are happening in the sector, not just the ones that we run. And so I invite you to follow us on all social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, to keep up to date with what we're up to, and just stay in touch. So thanks again to everyone for being here. It's been such a joy, such a pleasure, and such an honor. And I hope that you will be able to hold all of this close to you as you continue forward in what is just one step in a long but such a valuable journey. Thank you all for holding this space again. And I'll see you all soon.